Good evening and thank you for coming, and let me introduce you to a member of the Iona community who knows all about the nunnery. So, no, all right, so we'll leave it. You've come for this tonight. I'd like to talk about it as it is something which a lot of us know where it is and have sat in it. Perhaps you've had events in it or sat against those nice sun-warmed stones on a good day and just dreamt. Or, as occasionally I have, a candlelight service at night and you nip back in the morning to clear up. I've sung in the old nun's chapter house, which always intrigues the day visitors. We've all, I think, most of us would know where it was, but there is actually very little evidence about it. And while Iona has got so much work going on at present, now in the place names evidence, as well as the archaeology and recovering older archaeological work, the nunnery has been a bit left out. So I thought, great, this is my niche. See what we can make of it, especially as the period I'm interested in is the time when the Hebrides were part of a sub-kingdom of Norway and also a part of a Norwegian bishopric responsible to Trondheim, technically until 1472, though in fact, the Scottish bishops took over towards the end of that. So you can expect a certain amount of Norse influence as well, and sometimes wee hints of things that might have travelled through Iona from the Gaelic world to the Norse, and just hints, and we just see where the nuns may or may not have been involved. So it's a lovely place. I tried to say what we know, which isn't very much, what we can reasonably speculate about the buildings, their origins, why they're built where they are and how they're built, what the nuns did all day, where they came from, and so on, just trying to make it a bit more alive from what we can piece together. So hopefully I can get something from there. I'll try to shut up after 40 minutes, as I've been told to do, because people may have many things to contribute. So that's the nunnery with these couple of these very narrow, very high doors. Here it is. We're not really as big as we thought we were. You can see there, in terms with the Sahara, we're tiny, and it is stuck not a long way from the Scandinavian countries, which in this period of the Middle Ages meant that the Archbishopric of Trondheim, of Nidaros, which is now modern Trondheim in Norway, which is about halfway up modern Norway, also had its own Norwegian archbishoprics. It had the Northern Isles, the Faroe Islands, 2 bishoprics in Iceland, and 1 way over in southwestern Greenland, where there was, of course, a Norse colony for 500 years. It was big. And, of course, the one that really stuck in their craw every now and then, that of the Hebrides and Man. And towards the end, you get things, we don't want to go there, nobody wants to be bishop there, it's far too dangerous for journey and so on. And you think, something else going on here, it's nothing compared to going to Greenland. Is it because the language is different? Is it the culture is different? What is it? Anyway, that's a difference. There you are, Iona, right at the end of Mal. There you see both the abbey and the nunnery is there, sort of near the village area. A bit closer up. Beside it, the St. Ronan's, that little separate church, which we think was the parish church, and by the way, which is orientated due east. So, no, sorry, leave that. Yes, it is. So it means the nunnery church isn't. Oh yeah, I put this one in because it's the Sheen and the Gaegof, which I did write a number of years ago, and everyone's much more interested in that, and speculations about it, which I will talk about at the end if you want, but it's a very small, this rather well-worn, modestly worn figure is actually one of the number. And there's the nunnery, as many of us know, with these beautiful arcades, blocked up in the 15th century, with those windows above, and the ruins of the church. A place many of us find very important in terms of the spirituality of Iona, and that is important because whether you believe in such things or not, if people do, they will look after it. And so we have that. But its life didn't start without some lack of peace. Well, the site is, as I said, ancient. It's just a few feet from this the parish church, which is ancient, because when it was excavated, there was an older church below it, and below it were burials. So you're looking right to the very early years of St. Columba, perhaps 6th, 7th century there. Unfortunately, we don't know if there was the sex of the bones, they were too gone, but this is it from a side chapel. And this is bits of the nunnery itself. The ruined chapter house. And this one is part of the church before, in about 1831, the arch fell down and the roof over the high altar area. I've missed, somehow I don't, oh, that's the modern one, yes, that's what's left of it. A lovely 2-window light raised up there, and round the side of it you can just see a bit of the string course, that decorative limestone figuring course, which went all round the inside and the outside of the nunnery. Stopping a moment, I will say it may not have been the first nunnery on Iona. Archaeologist Catherine Forsyth gave a lecture last year at the University of Glasgow on some research she's doing on place names and archaeology. And for those who know Iona, the Martyrs Bay area has a small ancient gravesite just in the field on the side of the road, a humpy one. And that was excavated in 1969, and it seems to have been women's bones. And very unusually for a women's graveyard, it does not have any children with them, as small children often are. And it also, and I think the evidence is slight here, does suggest that the pelvic bones suggest that the women hadn't borne children, which is a fairly good idea. That points to nuns. Secondly, there are 2 place names. Nearby that burial ground, Anyala, is Clwyd Runach, which for years and years was interpreted as the place burial ground of the tradesmen, except that the place name work, looking back at through the dictionary of the language, suggests it actually better meant female tradespeople, and more specifically embroideresses. One of the jobs, of course, which is required in church life to make and maintain the vestments. And there is actually a little Wayne there is a hill of the embroideresses as well, though that hasn't actually been found yet. However, this nunnery does not seem to have been here in the same place, of course, in 1164, when there is a record in the annals about the different male foundations and communities on Iona, and how they lived very briefly, but no nuns. So either they didn't think they were important enough, or else if they knew what they were looking after, they just weren't there. My own thoughts has been, and I've argued in print, that the nunnery is actually older than the Benedictine monastery on Iona by about 20 years. It's always shoved in as a kind of afterthought to the rebuilding of the abbey as Benedictine. But when we look at the architecture, look at the politics and other reasons, it looks like it's older. And in some places, the monks copied or made it more grand. That's because just the political background was that the Hebrides and the Isle of Man were this unified sub-kingdom, more or less under the control or owing duty money to Norway. In 1156, it split, with Somerled of Argyll taking the large portion of the Hebrides to join his mainland possessions of his brother-in-law, who retained the kingship of the Isle of Man and the Isle of Lewis and possibly Skye. So it was split. Now, the Isle of Man got increasingly drawn into English politics, especially after the Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland, where the Isle of Man was quite useful for fleets and protecting the port. And the Isles got involved into the Gaelic insurgents in Ireland and the response of alliances. And Norway every now and then kept putting the boot in and saying, we want tribute, we want this and that. And every now and then the Hebrides went off to fight as mercenaries in the civil wars in Norway. And then, of course, in the 13th century, the Scottish Crown, which always had this interest in Iona as a burial ground, decided to weigh in more and more. And eventually, after an inconclusive battle down the road, it was all solved by selling the Hebrides to Scotland. except the Scots still haven't paid. So Iona, in the middle of all this, was a place for cross-current. You had the political power from Scotland, of course, all that period, but also from Norway, from Ireland, with the intermarriages, and so on. And in the midst of this, you have this quiet nunnery. Well, mostly quiet. One of the things I think is not just after the Benedictine Abbey, because the Benedictine Abbey was established by charter in December 1203. Building started at once that summer. Also that summer, word got back to Derry, and angry clergy sailed over in their small boats onto Iona, stopped the building, demolished the destruction of the site done without permission, got word of that abbot, put their own abbot in, and sailed away saying, job done. Must have been quite disturbing for the nuns, who I think were already there. Whenever it started, I'm suggesting the 1180s, and that's in last Scottish Historical Review from 2 years ago. This church is not orientated due east. Interestingly, neither is the Abbey, or neither is the Relic Oran, the cemetery chapel. They're all different degrees south of east. And it seems likely that that was an orientation due to the rising of the sun on a particular day, particular feast day. What's called the azimuth is, means that this would be either the 14th of February for the nunnery or the 27th of October. So going through the lists of various saints and martyrologies, didn't find very much. You have to take off 7 days because then to get into the Julian calendar by the sun. Consider it could not have been too accurate, perhaps, because, there might have been other buildings, other structures, this and that. So my main suggestion is actually not the 7th of February, but a few days earlier, 2nd of February, the presentation of the Virgin Mary in the temple. It's also a good way to start a nunnery. And, of course, the day before, you have St. Bridget. So that would have caught the sunlight on those days in that window, lovely 2-point arch. Can't really prove this, but of course Bridget was popular in Western Scotland, and she was, of course, another virgin saint and a nun. There's another thing I've been working on slightly, which is whether there was a notion of Mary as prioress, as abbess. This was always headed by a prioress. Oh, there's St. Bridget for you. That's 1900 version. She's in the Abbey. This is one of the side aisle on Iona Nunnery. And in this, on the arch, you can see to this side, there's a sort of long strip in the stone in relief at an angle. That is actually part, you can very faintly see it, it's part of a crook, an abbatical crook. Between that and these very high doors, narrow but high, when you think you've got to get the doorpost in, these are narrow doors, but they're also quite high in proportion. I have wondered whether, just like, for example, in some of the French 11th century foundations, there was the notion, the understanding that the abbess, the ultimate boss in the nunnery, was actually Mary. This is the tombstone of one of the late 16th century prioresses, Anna MacLean, who is there in full sort of gear. She's wearing her cloak, of course, her habit. On top of it, she's wearing a rochet, which is a pleated garment, doesn't quite go down to her feet. On each side of her, at hip level, are 2 bumps. Those are actually lapdogs, which are not part of the religious gear, but were very popular in nunneries at the time. There's her tombstone, and before about 1830, when it was damaged, probably when the roof came down, you had this. She was on one panel at the bottom. This was sketched. On the top, you have Virgin Mary, mitred, like an abbess, holding the child without lapdogs. And, it seems to be, just a possibility that there was this understanding that went through all that period. So just a thought. Anyway, back to the building. It's been dated to the early beginning of the 13th century, but these architectural features and other reasons do suggest perhaps the 1180s. It's quite a complicated argument about politics and truth, but it was. And if so, it would be very much like some of the nunneries in Ireland, which were or became Augustinian canonesses at about this period, part of an Augustinian reform, and took on from the early Christian monastic models, attached to Columban abbeys. So if there were other places in Ireland where you had these Augustinian nunneries attached to Columban abbeys founded, that could have suggested where did these nuns came from? Where these nuns came from? They must have learnt to be nuns somehow. And you have to train, and also you have models, and particularly your choice of which rule, Augustinian and so on. And it's also possible, and this is something I'd like to speak to Irish scholars about, whether in fact in the late 12th century there was, due to the Anglo-Norman fights causing the wars in Ireland caused by the Anglo-Normans, there were in fact nunneries that might have decamped en masse to the relative safety of Iona. And to safety. Of course, Derry is most popular, but we're not sure it was founded. And this is because, I put this in because carving atop of piers you often find in the abbey, very similar. And you also have this lovely little window on the side chapel in the nunnery. The archway is very beautiful. It's, I think one of my images is missing because I had that image of a kind of double modelling, which then you get in the about 1210 in the Abbey Chapter House, which, as you see, is still used. I haven't any idea what they're doing there, but they're using it. That kind of double arch is a kind of double. It's bigger, stronger, but it's like it's modelled on that nunnery one, where one film hasn't come out. And then a few years later, about 10 years later, with the Gothic point in the Abbey Church itself, that's the raised choir loft. So you see the sort of model of three patterns of these ornamentation. That's double in the nunnery. A lot of these things are, the nuns have done this, let's do a bit better or bigger. And so you get that. And this you can now see that this little, back to the nunnery, that little window, actually they got this one bit wrong. The roof of the side chapel isn't quite high enough. The point of the arch is way up there. So they must have built it on this very Irish style and then built the roof and realised it wasn't quite right. And then about 1220, they built exactly the same abbey, up in the abbey, in the choir loft. So, unless this is very, very late nunnery indeed for this kind of architecture, you say, well, the nuns got there first, and that's the outside of it. And you see also it's beautifully made, all this limestone cornering, and, the abbey was rather thrown up, and the nunnery was built all of a piece originally. So there's lots of things like that, which I think suggest it is definitely a bit older. So the nuns were there from about the 1180s. We know who the first prioress was. She was called Behoc, and she was the daughter of Somerled of Argyll, who had taken the southern half of the Isles. And if she was the first prioress, she'd been very old indeed by the 1220s. If this was founded then. She was probably born in the 1140s, and she was the owner of the Psalter, the Iron of Psalter, we presume, in the National Museum of Scotland, which is the National Library, this is. It's actually about 1200, said to be from the Oxford area, but has various Iona saints named in it, and it was from an Augustinian. So she may have been one of the founders of that family with her own wealth, perhaps a widow, able to endow, perhaps she trained in Ireland. We don't know very much about her, but we do know that she must have been, by her background, a powerful woman. Now, why on earth was it stated to be later, the early 13th century? It's largely because of much later comments. In the 15th century, Walter Bauer said the nunnery was first. He was prior of Inchcolm, which is also, of course, the Columban Foundation over the other side. Scotland and a noted historian. So he declares, I, or Iona in Hebrew, which is said Dove, or Columba in Latin, or Icolm Hill, where there are 2 monasteries founded by St. Columba, one of black monks, which means Benedictines, and the other of holy nuns of the order of St. Augustine, who wear the rochet, that's the limit, and there is a sanctuary there. Now, the rochet is that linen garment which was worn in choir, which Prioress Anna was in. But I love the thing is, he thinks, of course, that Columba founded the male monastery first. He didn't wrong about they weren't, of course, Benedictines until 1203. But I love the way in which that's factual, and then he gets on to the nuns who are holy. Quite right too. Of course, they're the same order. So there you are. And there's the sanctuary. So he thinks he was wrong, but he puts them second. But of course, in his time, women were of secondary importance. And then you get the Book of Clanranald in the 17th century. Somerled had good family. Behog, daughter of Somerled, was a religious woman and a black nun. 3 monasteries in Ragnall, King of the Isles, 3 monasteries were erected by him. A monastery of black monks, Benedictines on Iona, in honour of God and Columba, a monastery of black nuns in the same place, and a monastery of grey friars at Saddle in Kintyre, and so on. So they say, right, monks came first, so on. Of course, the Benedictines weren't there till 1203. The Columban monastery had 650 years of an early Christian rule before it became refounded as Benedictine. And, black nun, she wasn't a black nun, she was actually, she was more black, but she was Augustinian, and so on. And because of that, even though we know that, for example, Saddle in Kintyre was founded first and put last, it seems that it's been expected that it was a bit later. And I'm afraid, whatever the difficulties over the centuries, that's not really good enough for the 21st to have that distinction. If you found something, even if you haven't got a strong bishop, you're usually expected to ask. And also, it was quite a forceful archbishopric. Now, this was a period when they had meant to go to Nidaros, Trondheim, and at this period, the whole period, there were 3 very forceful archbishops there, and they were responsible ultimately. And they can be regarded as sympathetic to Augustinian choice of rule, because Erland Erlingsson I was a notable reformer, clashed frequently with secular authority. In other words, he actually got thrown out of Norway, went into exile in England, came back a few years later with a copy of the Martyrdom of Thomas à Becket under his arm, translated into Old Norwegian, and said, look, don't mess with me, I could become a saint. Anyway, he was establishing Augustinians in Norway, followed by 2 Augustinian archbishops, Ivar Erika Ivarsson and Thorri Guðmundarson, and there was constant problems with the Norwegian crown. And, in fact, one of the others was also, I think it was Ivar, was sent, exiled as well. They couldn't really ignore it, while they had quite a powerful king in Norway as well. So that was the kind of pressure. And this is Eystein Erlingsson, who is said to have built the great cathedral at Nidaros in Trondheim. I don't know if anyone's been in it. Beautiful, but this is a modern version of him as a founding saint. Tough bug. And that is the nunnery, which may have been dependent in all its beauty. And of course it won't be excavated in any apart from keyhole excavations. Very fragile and very beautiful. There was another visitor actually in 1203, just from the point of view of what happened with the monks who were trying to re-establish as Benedictine in the same holy site. Put him in. The Bishop of Greenland actually was in Rome that winter. Being a Bishop of Greenland was usually a dampener on an ecclesiastical career. To put it mildly, it took a good 3 weeks to get there on a good summer's day. The first one got out and got back to Norway. The second one went looking for America and was never seen again. One of the later ones went missing for 19 years and was found holed up in luxury in the Faroe Islands. As one does. But this one, I know. Jon Smirre, he actually got to Norway. He got to Rome, got back and got buried in his own cathedral with his walrus crozier and his "There you are, poor man," dug up by the Norwegians, by the Danes in the 20th century. And that I just put into, because that's his cathedral lands, which are now farmed again, because we don't often see pictures of Greenland. And that's the end of his cathedral. But that's just a side effect. But that's on a good summer's day there, no snow. But those are the kind of pressures you got. You know, you had this wonderful connection right across this. Anyway, let's get back to the nunnery. That is the door into the cloisters from the church. So I'm asked, who were they? Well, some of them would have been noble women of a locality or elsewhere, like Behok. Perhaps some Irish ones too, especially in the early days. Lay nuns would have been local. Never very big, would have sung in choir. And that's a question which often asked on Iona is, what did they do all day? And because we actually don't have any records that they left, you work it out from the rule of St. Augustine for women and other, what we know from other sources. Well, the Augustinian rule goes back to a letter written about the year 400 by St. Augustine of Hippo to assist women in the monastic life. And it was later adapted, and the houses are independent of each other, and then there was a male rule involved. The sisters, and that includes his own biological sister, by the way, he says, are to live in charitable harmony, to respect the inferiors and the sick. The superior shares her duties of office with members of her community. The sick, the cellar, that's for food, the wardrobe, that's the clothes making, and another is the guardian of the books to distribute among the sisters. They would have been the lay sisters, the choir nuns would of course have been literate, and some of them might well have copied manuscripts, as happened elsewhere. They certainly would have needed these books and additional work for devotional reading. The idea that nuns didn't read or didn't have these, it's not so. We know they had them. The nuns had to make their own habits, which actually ladies on the whole wouldn't have done. They would have had their own, but here they do in the rule. So there's a certain degree of equality. Prayer in common is said in the chapel at stated hours, comprising of hymns, psalms and readings. Certain prayers are recited and others are sung, etc. So you have a whole rule of what you do, and that's 7 times a day in choir, including the night office. In the middle of the night, they had the 2-sleep model of living, in monastic life. The morning service, the small ones, the 3 small ones, the great vespers at the close of the working day, and Compline later on. So they would have spent a lot of time singing and reciting prayers in choir, and presumably having some time of personal prayer. Now, where's my 11th one? Somebody printed this for me. So they would have had this kind of aspect. They would have had a Eucharist celebrated, of course, by one of the monks from up the road, and if wanted, could lead a more contemplative life, special devotions. We also know from his other works how much he valued a theology of beauty, which I think is always present in this nunnery, as a beauty as a way to God, and especially the beauty of music. One who sings twice, prays twice. So the primary work of of choir nuns is to sing the offices, all 7, and so on. And so we can imagine coming through the cloisters at night time as well. Daily meeting in the chapter house, which I showed you earlier, which is planning the day, the work of the day, land management, new members, discipline within the community, charity, division of work, farming needs, the works of ladies of the cloisters, which might have been herbalism, certainly would have been something like care of the vestments, so sewing, weaving, or particularly of the fine fabrics and so on, making their own clothes. The lay sisters would have helped with the more domestic work, the cattle, the sheep, the external work. And also inquire in the chapter house. They would have listened to stories of saints and such like, and also over meals. So they may have grown flax for their linen vestments. So a lot of this aspect. There's always been a bit of a shock too, but in 1922, when this was all established as a nunnery, established as a garden, they found 4 silver spoons and a gold circlet, rather like a tiara. Now, what were these doing in a nunnery, people say? Why were they dressing up? The thing is, it could have been a young girl, because they did also educate young girls of an ability in this kind of convent. And it would have been for safekeeping and for when she went out and got married. Or it could have been somebody's dower brought into the nunnery deliberately so you could dress a statue, just as they do in southern places. They put clothes on statues and circlets and such like. So it could have been adornment. I'm hoping to see these tomorrow. They're not on display, but Morgan has. So it might have been liturgical uses as well. So on to south, they would have had orchards, gardens, education, and also they would have kept their beautiful church in good condition, plastered, painted and such like. And it's very likely there was a hostel for pilgrims, especially for women pilgrims who came to Iona, needed to stay somewhere. And you have to provide medication for sore feet and boils, a lot of time perhaps spent listening to their distress, and so on. Always poorer than the monks, of course, but quite a lot of busy work. And of course it would have been like a large farm. So that is the kind of day, full day, and before you got to bed, you got into the warming room, one place apart from a kitchen where you actually had a fire, and you got yourself warmed up before you went to bed, which you would have had to sleep in, quite contrary to normal rule at the time. You'd had to sleep in your own bed. Usually you had a couple of nice warm companions in a bed in a family situation. But here you're on your own, you wanted to be warmed. And they would have had visits and so on. And they may well have even towards the end have had lapdogs or care for the prioress's lapdogs. And yeah, they might have been skimped, but there would have been enough to do. Then there is an area which I'm working on because it is very fragile indeed, and it may relate more to the monks up the road than the nuns, but you can never be sure because the new communities were there. And that is, every now and then in the Scandinavian world, you get little hints of knowledge of the Gaelic world. Not just the political cooings and froings of, the clerics, violence in the Isles, come and help us, this kind of business, or kings of Norway summoning kings to summoning kings of the Isles up to Norway. You just get these hints. There's a lovely bit. One of the books you find of a Norwegian court, and most Nordic writing is Icelandic. Even when they're writing about Norwegian kings, it's Icelanders doing it. That bit further, they were forever coming to the court and finding jobs as writers. But there's a 14th century book in Old Norwegian, which is rarer, called The King's Mirror. It tells you how to be a king, how to trade, what your good courtly manners are, you name it. But it also has a whole series on the wonders of Ireland, including a lovely story about the UFO, which you also find in Irish sources, about an airship seen in the air over Clonmacnoise. Anyway, somebody in this boat in the air throws an anchor down, it gets caught in the church door, and a man comes swimming through the air trying to release it, and people are trying to drag him. And the cleric says, "No, let go," and he swims up, gasping for air, and they sail off. Now, lovely bit of it's there, and it's also in this Norwegian version as one of the wonders of Ireland, as well as in two, I think three Irish sources. And there's some wonderful stories about that kind of thing. There's also a bizarre little encounter that is usually told as a rather rude story. It is a group in 1098, Norwegian king Magnus Barelegs had been raiding and then was in Ireland, and he was going to send hostages to the Irish king, Murderach O'Brien. And on the way, there was a Norwegian with them who said, "Well, let me do the introductions. I can speak Irish, Gaelic." They said, "Very well." So they went up to the king, said, "Damn you, king." And so it went on downhill from there. Fortunately, it is a bit like he'd been set up. I don't know, he's usually told of a sort of cockney in the Highland Regiment, "You tell the sergeant so-and-so in Gaelic, it means good morning." And of course it doesn't. Same story, you get in 12th century thing. So he was set up. So you have that lovely little conversations. And you also get quite a lot about sailings. And a particular version in 1202 where the actual people in a storm made for Canna, which was an Iona dependency. And they knew very clearly where they were going in spite of the storm. They also got ripped off by the local king when they were there, but that's part of the background. So in the earlier period, Alexander II of Scotland, 1249, he was thinking of invading the Hebrides. And he was there stuck, near Donnelly and Oban. And he had a dream. And in this dream, 3 saints came to him to warn him against invading the Hebrides. And this being a dream, he recognised them. There was Olav of Norway, patron of Norway, Magnus of Orkney, and the fiercest of them, Columcille of Iona, who was very short, very bald in front, who'd warned him off. I think that very bald in front can only come from somebody who knew about the old frontal tonsure, which was abandoned centuries before on Iona, and it's there. Why else this particular detail? Anyway, so Columcille, who is in the Norse sources sometimes called Columba, sometimes called Columcille, keeps changing, warns them all off. King is very worried about his dream, by the way, tells people, says really worried about this. However, he goes ahead from Donnelly Castle off Oban and he starts invading the Hebrides, gets to Kerrera, just off the shore, and dies. Serves him right. Don't mess with saints. So then you have to wait for his son to be old enough to do any invading. But you get those little details, or you get a whole story about the settlement of Iceland involving a certain unknown Bishop Patrick and the setting up of a chapel to St. Columba on Iceland. This is, just the settlement period, one of the few Christians among those Vikings. And by the way, it is now a place where there's an outdoor cross, a replica of the John's Cross on Iona, as a kind of outdoor worship centre. So there are these things, and then there is an extraordinary story about Haltfreda, who is a pagan who becomes a kind of Christian to the saint who converted Iceland, who was a Norwegian saint. Always, by the way, it's always in the Norse sources, Iona is called Egin Helga, the Holy Island. And he, anyway, right at the end of his life, Halfreda, who is a kind of reluctant Christian, a relapsing Christian on a regular basis while his patron is alive, settles in Sweden but wants to go back to his native Iceland. And he has been, some years before, his patron St. Olaf says, he gives him gifts, a helmet, an arm ring of gold, and a mantle of very costly fabric, and says, "These will go into the coffin with you." Now, on that journey, the sea voyage from Sweden to Iceland, suddenly they get a big storm. And Halfreda is also very sick. But he knows he's dying. He gives his sword to his son and says, "Give me the gifts to go in my coffin with me, the helm, the arm ring, and the costly mantle." And they duly do. After which, having a coffin on board, it seems, just ready for them, they put it overboard, and though they are way to the north of the Faroes by this stage, it wafts its way down to Iona for burial. A couple more problems there, but it does actually gets buried on Iona. And the helmet is made into a candlestick, the arm ring into a chalice, and the costly fabric garment into an altar cloth. Now, that strikes me as that kind of detail can suggest, however they got there as payment for burial, those actually could have been donated at some time and be available for viewing on the island. So I quite like the costly mantle being sewn into an altar cloth by the nuns. But we do have those kind of details, and more can come out. So they don't tell you anything directly, but they do say this part of the island of Iona with its chapter house is gossip, and that was part of a later, which I won't talk about tonight. And of course there's always rainbows on island, but it was a real mix. Well, that's a Sheila again, at a distance. Those are some of the others. Oh, right, and we'll stick on that one. There's always rainbows there, but they come over the nunnery as well. There were lots of influences at play, and you have a nunnery in the middle of this. They were there for best part of 400 years. It died out quite naturally in the end, attached to a Columban foundation, perhaps relating to an earlier one, relating to a foundation perhaps orientated towards the feast of the Presentation of Mary and St. Bridget. The Irish influence must have died out after 1265 when the Scottish influence became much more powerful. Perhaps there were reasons why the nuns came, perhaps from Ireland. And what was the influence of the Norwegians? Material passed orally. It can actually pass through nuns as well as monks. It's not the most remote of nunneries, even if it wasn't this mix of different cultures. There was for a time actually in Greenland a tiny nunnery. But with sufficient patronage, it was much less fragile at times of turbulence than we might expect, and survived until the last nuns at the Reformation were pensioned off and lived another 20 years there, until the final members with their prioress handed over their home to the MacLeans of Duart. The later nunnery, I think my colleague Janet would be a great one to talk about. But thanks very much for listening. My time's up.
Thanks so much. Do you have any questions? No. Yes.
So, I wondered what was going on before 1180 when the nunnery was built, in 1203 when new Benedictine Abbey was built. So what was going on earlier in the, say, 1100s? Was there any sort of religious community on Iona then, either male or female? Or was this some sudden newness around 1200?
Right. There was a continuous community on Iona from the time of St. Columba. Due to the Viking raids, they founded Kells inland, and the abbot and others, the sort of head of the Columba family of monasteries, went there. And then later on that went to Derry. But there was always monastic life on Iona, and we know that in the 1080s, 100 years before this, Queen Margaret of Scotland is said to have rebuilt some of the ruinous buildings there. 1164 was a whole record in the annals of Ulster, because there was a time of considering taking Iona back as the head of this Columban familia, which really didn't suit Scotland. Among others, it gave far too much power to that Somerled family on their western borders. But we know from that they had the abbot, the main community. There was a community of male ascetics. There was a hermit, and we know the name of the abbot at the time. There's no mention of nuns, which makes me think there weren't any in 1164. And also, the dates of Behoc, she could have been born as late as 1165, actually, because her father was killed the previous year. But we probably, her dates fit for late 12th century. The architecture fits being older than the abbey. You can't prove this but the records putting it as secondary are actually about putting it secondary in importance. And after 300 or 400 years, getting a few decades wrong is not that bad. The trouble is that we have so few records for the 12th century, And because Norway was embroiled in civil wars at the time, and with it largely carted, by the way, by two kings, one of whom was half Irish, and then his son, who was half Hebridean. So Norway had a bad time with civil wars with these lot. They were sort of, the records are inclined to be inward looking. And so it's difficult. We're piecing together bits from a diplomatic, but so this is a speculation on a suitable time which suits the Augustinian reforms in Ireland and elsewhere, because this was very much still part of the Gaelic world. Whatever Norway thought and whatever Scotland thought, it was. Is that?
I just wonder, is there any charter evidence for the nunnery? I wonder, how many landholdings elsewhere in Scotland?
There are none for the founding. There are bits of later charters, often incorporated into the abbey, which show, for example, that the nunnery had the southern part, that upland part of the south of Iona, and they seem to have pastured their cattle there. And that seems to have gone on as cattle pasturage for years. They had some on Mull, on behalf of Mull, Inch Kenneth, some on South Uist, certainly some on Tyree, which of course was the barley basket, and the Monarch Islands, Hayskir, off west of North Uist, now abandoned. There was a chapel there, but they own those lands. I've always got these visions of some intrepid prioress getting in the boat and going to inspect. So they had parcels, and of course it's difficult always to know when they got them, whether the initial foundation was endowed with them, which was very common out of the Somerled lands, and or whether they were acquired later by wealthy donors who gave them prayers for their soul. I didn't mention there was actually the last Norwegian raiding of Iona happened in 1210. It was there'd been civil wars in Norway. There was anyway, the erstwhile enemies, this dreadful story. Erstwhile enemies banded together, possibly initially with royal assent to collect tribute, but went on a full-scale raiding party of the Hebrides, including Iona, in order to raise funds for a joint pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So, anyway, by the way, one of their ships sank. So yeah, we know a bit of turbulence there. So,
in terms of Christianity and politically and strategically, was it development of the previous pagan spiritual stuff?
I'm not sure I heard that one.
Is it built on previous sacred space, for example, pagan spaces?
Yes. Certainly this nunnery site is very much close to that St. Ronan's, which was early Christian sacred space, and there were other early Christian sacred spaces, including the Raleigh Chapel and others, which we can only really find by bones, like that nunnery, that early Christian nunnery. There was at one stage, the pollen dating did seem to suggest that some of those enormous vallum, the ditch and dyke foundations, that the pollen count seemed to go back to much earlier period, late Roman or 2nd century or something. There wasn't any Roman finds, but that has been re-looked at, and in fact the pollen dating hasn't shown that. So it's in the phase of who knows, until it's probably pollen evidence with that age. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes. How can you see what size the community of nuns would have been on average over the piece?
The choir nuns were probably only about 10 or so, if you look at the space. The lay nuns would have been more in the nave of the church, the working nuns, as pilgrims may have been. But just looking at it, it doesn't suggest a very large nunnery. There's not much known about particular nuns after Behok. One or two are mentioned. One was the daughter of one of the monks. Let us be charitable and say he was a widower who entered religious life late. Some of the actual late abbots were dreadful men. One they couldn't get rid of. He kept his whole family in the abbot's house, And sleeping alone there occasionally, I was sort of creaking, thinking, you know too much about the past, it's just, that's all we can work out from size and space and analogy with similar nunneries elsewhere.
Yes.
You mentioned that they had herbalist activities within the nunnery, and I wondered if that would be reserved for the nuns themselves, or whether they would be able to offer some kind of healing to the wider community. And I'm particularly thinking, since they have that sculpture, the Sheila that you called it, the Mary and the baby, that to me, if you're literate, looks like a place where mothers in pregnancy and early child rearing might be welcome if there's problems. And I just wondered if that was something that was a possibility.
It was not at all uncommon for monastic communities to have, a herb garden. And there is a record that the herbs were still to be found on Iona in the 18th century, rare herbs which must have been, residue of those herb gardens. I have to disagree with you. I think Machine the Gig is probably which wouldn't have been in the public view at the time. It would have, that road is 1837. That bit of the island would have been, say, their nunneries, their private gardens, their vegetable plots. I think it is there actually to scare away the devil. Obviously, I've also written, but it's quite a complicated and, shall we say, it involves some fairly strong biological terms to go through this argument. But I think that's the most satisfactory. That is my view.